Okay, John Thomas, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good. I'm using my headphones today so we can have a good recording. I'm hoping it's going to work just fine. But yeah, I'm excited to do this one today because we've been talking about this for a while in terms of the epigenetic component of the cars on the highway as we teach. And we want to know, how does that relate to your specific genetic type that we teach? And before we even get into that, John, I don't want to give the impression that the sky is falling, but with that being said, how would you estimate that, with our environment in today's day and age, heavy metals are prevalent in the demographic or the people that we're seeing on a daily basis?
Yeah, the thing is, the world we live in today, heavy metals, chemicals, we're not going to get away from. You're going to get exposed to them. It's just the way the world is now. But the real question is how effective does your body get rid of them? And that's where the problem lies, is because some people, based on genetic predisposition, they're able to clear faster than they are accumulating. And the problem lies is on the opposite side of the spectrum, that if you cannot clear these metals and chemicals faster than you accumulate them, what happens is you're going to accumulate these toxins. It's going to put more traffic on the highway. Biochemistry or your biochemistry or function is going to slow down, and with that, chronic symptoms are going to set in. And so when we talk about kind of the elephant in the room with this whole genetic type concept, and one thing that I see with patients is we're trying to classify them into what their genetic type is, to really simplify the process down to determine what rabbit holes they got to go down. And if somebody kind of comes up where they fall into like every single genetic type, or they fall into 3 or more genetic types, more often than not, they are a toxic accumulator. And the biggest priority is the accumulation of metals or chemicals that's just bogging down everything. And so, we know as a epigenetic factor, heavy metals are going to affect methylation. They're gonna shut down methylation in terms of how our body can recycle B12. Heavy metals are going to affect peroxidation. So our body's ability to control inflammation and free radical is going to be impaired by metals. And we also know heavy metals can inhibit or shut down bioptin recycling. So that our body's ability to make adequate neurochemistry is going to be altered as well. And there is so much medical research. This isn't us kind of saying heavy metals are bad. This is in the published medical journals on how heavy metals, specifically things like mercury and aluminum, and now we're seeing a whole lot of research on glyphosate, are huge taxing burdens to enzymatic function, how our bodies work day in, day out.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is scary. And so that's why we do these things, so that we can empower the patient, have them have an effective way of organizing their information, because they are overwhelmed and they need to know where to start. So I guess a good starting point for us is, let's kind of break it down in terms of how we would approach sort of first someone who's a toxic accumulator, and then from there, what specific enzymes that we would look at in their DNA report, besides identifying them as a certain genetic type, but what specific key enzymes we would hone in on to know that these metals are going to impact that, and kind of go from there.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the toxic accumulator, really from a genetic standpoint, we could list, pretty much every gene that we've talked about in previous episodes, or we could list pretty much all the genes we've talked about, all the other genetic types. What we did is we kind of classified the biggest disruptors, meaning the genes, the enzymes we know that have the greatest affinity for heavy metals to inhibit or slow them down even more. And like I said, these kind of fall into things that deal with B12 recycling. We know there's a boatload of research on methionine synthase and heavy metals, specifically mercury. Okay. And what methionine synthase is if you talk about MTHFR and how MTHFR plays into this, yes, MTHFR plays into this, but it's like you have MTHFR, and then the next step in that process that feeds into methylation is your methionine synthase enzyme. So your MTR gene. And heavy metals, specifically mercury, aluminum, lead, are going to just put a copious amount of traffic on the highway and slow that down. So if you've got an MTHFR defect and you are taking methylfolate, you can take all the methylfolate you want in the world, but if you got heavy metals that's slowing down methionine synthase function, your methylation cycle is not going to do a whole lot. All right, and that's where a lot of times people, take methylfolate and feel worse. It's just, you're not able to push things further downstream. So one of the genes that we look at in this toxic accumulator site or type is methionine synthase, because if somebody goes into it with a genetic predisposition where they've got, one mutation or one variant or two variants, so their highway is narrow to start with, it creates more of a mess when you have that exposure to those chemicals or metals. If you got a mouthful of metal fillings, and for decades that mercury's leached into your system, it's going to put a whole lot of traffic on the highway. Some of the other genes we look at are the genes in the peroxidation pathway. And I'm big on peroxidation pathway in terms of inflammation control, because what happens is we get that delicate balance between iron and copper that drives Finton reactions, that just fuels, a lighter fluid on a fire from an inflammation side of things. And so we look at things in that peroxidation pathway like SOD enzymes and catalase enzymes and glutathione peroxidase enzymes, because we know metals will disrupt that. So it'll really become a huge inhibitor or a kind of a huge weight in how our body can control and clear inflammation out. And so if you go into a genetic weakness in those enzymes and you add heavy metals into the burden, it is a huge perfect storm. And these people that have genetic weakness and have an increase in heavy metal exposure and that accumulation has happened over years, these are the people that have a lot going on. And what we see, people that have those stories are those people that typically have a lot of sensitivities. I mean, they're losing tolerance to their environment. They're losing tolerance to foods. So they have more and more food sensitivities. They're losing tolerance to chemicals. From a fragrance standpoint, they walk into a room with a candle burn and they fall apart. They walk down the aisle at a grocery store in the cleaning section, and then just the fumes itself, they can become more and more sensitive. That's a really, really good indicator that you've got this accumulation of these chemicals that are really bogging down liver function, but specifically bogging down peroxidation. And then we also look at some of the phase 1 based genes, that from a liver standpoint, and then some of the other more sensitive, topics that are out there now, like the PON1 enzymes, which people may have heard us talk about before, that deal specifically with the liver's ability to clear pesticides. So the ones we've kind of narrowed down to this toxic accumulator type, because realistically, I could have had a list of like 50 plus genes in this, but we kind of narrowed it down as like, where are the usual suspects? Where do people that have a accumulation of metals or chemicals in the body, what are the handful of genes that are the starting points? What are the players, if you start supporting that from a genetic predisposition standpoint, and you slowly layer in detoxification protocols, that is going to be enough to get the needle going in the right direction. And so we're talking about B12, we're talking about peroxidation, we're talking about liver function in itself are the key players in that toxic accumulator.
Yeah, and there's a lot in there that you said, John. So the first thing is that when we're starting with people, when we started our first course, it was the MTHFR crash course, where a lot of people coming in through the front door are coming in with the idea that I have or I don't have MTHFR. And you kind of explained how that could be such a big mistake when we're talking about these epigenetic or cars on the highway that really make an MTHFR irrelevant in this case. And then you mentioned that it's really the MTR or the methionine synthase that helps to recycle B12 that will be slowed down from all those cars on the highway. And then as the result, maybe talk about like what they would see in terms of their blood work, like is B12 high or low, or what other impact would that have besides being a toxic accumulator if they're not doing their whole methionine cycle, and how that ties into anxiety or mood disorders or insomnia. Maybe talk a little bit about the MTR B12 domino effect besides accumulating a lot of toxins.
Right. Yeah, because when we're talking about MTHFR, like I said, methylfolate feeds in your methionine cycle, and it feeds into your methionine cycle through that methionine synthase enzyme, that MTR enzyme. And so you need two things. You need B9 and B12 to be able to go through that enzyme to be able to methylate adequately. So from a lab standpoint, you could see abnormal homocysteine. You could see homocysteine levels high or low, meaning if it's high, you don't have the B12 there to recycle to pick homocysteine back up. It could be low just because maybe you can't put enough gas in the tank because everything's getting stuck there. You can also see, like you said, abnormal B12 levels. These are sometimes people that have very, very high B12, but they're still deficient inside the cells. So when you run serum B12 levels, there's plenty outside knocking on the door, but it just isn't being utilized adequately inside the cell because of heavy metals blocking how effective you can get B12 from outside to inside. And then you can go a little further in terms of the recycling aspect, within the methylation cycle itself. But there's a lot of other things that you could look at from a standpoint with methionine synthase. Number one is from a genetic side of things. If you've got those genes, if you've got gene variants on MTR through, looking at a 23andMe or Ancestry, the functional genomic analysis test that we use, you can we're probably going to want to consider, right out of the gate, assessing heavy metal burn on the body. If you got chronic symptoms and you've got methionine synthase genetic variants and you've taken methylated B vitamins or a multi and it didn't move the needle at all, your next step without a doubt is you want to determine this toxic accumulation burden, because it is that big of an issue. And it is one of those issues that when people fall into this toxic accumulator genetic component, when we see variants in these genes we listed, more often than not, there is an accumulation where metals are at play.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge cheat sheet note, John, in terms of, okay, get your genetic test results, look under your methionine cycle, look at MTR and some other research-based study, FUT2 and other enzymes that can really slow down that B12 recycling, and then really look at your metals, your environmental load that would slow the cars on that 2 or 4 lane highway already even further. So what tests typically do you like to use for heavy metal assessment?
So that's kind of one of those things where there's really no right or wrong answer. My thing is just pick one and use it. Now, with that being said, we want to compare the benefits of the different type of heavy metal testing that's out there. A lot of people will do, through LabCorp, just get their blood metals done and be like, I'm in the clear. That really doesn't tell you anything. That's probably the worst way to go, because heavy metals will not hang around in the blood very long. It changes the pH of the blood, and it's a very, very problematic thing if metals are in the blood. Typically, if metals show up in the blood, it's usually there's like a really heavy ongoing exposure going on. As an example, all the time, a couple of years back in Michigan with the lead in the water. Somebody like that, lead is going to show up in the blood because there's an ongoing exposure there. We're talking about, previous exposure, just that accumulation effect over years and years and years where you're not able to clear it. So if you can't clear it, your body's going to store it. And now you have that buildup that it happens over time. One of the best ways to do that is looking at other means, which is, picking something, whether it be fecal through stool test, something like a urine test, or hair analysis. Okay. I would just say pick one, and basically the analysis you use is going to gear you towards, is there a metal burden on the body? There's good and bad of all of them. The good and bad, or bad components with the urine and fecal is a lot of times you got to do them where they're called provocative challenges, where you got to take some type of detoxifying agent or some chelating agent to be able to stimulate the release of those metals. Now, if somebody's a toxic accumulator and they've got genetic weakness, they got a lot of traffic on the highway, that's gonna be the last thing you wanna do is kind of poke the sleeping bear and release some things back into the system. Now, hey, risk reward, if it's gonna get you information from a testing standpoint, you just suck it up and go with it. But the thing is, some people are so sensitive, they can't tolerate that, okay? It can really spiral them downward. So hair analysis is great. And there's also a test called a urine porphyrins test, which is a decent screening test, which looks at metabolites of how heavy metals are affecting your biochemistry, which can give you a lot of insight and information in terms of how metals and chemicals are a player in terms of how you feel, the way you feel. So really, there's not an exact science. The only thing I do recommend is don't go by blood, because it's not the most accurate way. So work with somebody that, you know, is qualified to understand how to interpret these tests, or kind of get yourself educated through things we put out there on how to interpret these different tests. Pick one, run with it, and that information is going to tell you if heavy metals are a player.
Okay, awesome. So let's say it is, they do a hair test. They know that they're a MTR carrier that's variated, and they see there's a burden there. What would be some of the other things that you'd be wanting to make sure that you implement? Because you said slowly, right? Then you start slowly. So what is it that you're doing foundationally, where we see a lot of people run into problems when they don't go slowly, because they haven't looked at the whole picture, and they haven't really paid the priorities, and really supported the foundational stuff first. So what would be other priorities from you, from a doctor standpoint of, okay, yep, that's a major thing, we want to support that? It's a hard question, because there's so many other nuances, right?
Yeah, because the thing is, you know, to kind of answer that, I'll just use the example I see all the time. Is basically people working with other practitioners themselves have tried to detoxify metals. Okay, maybe they already know that they have a heavy metal burden, right? So they go and they do some type of protocol, whether it be something really aggressive like IV chelation, which a lot of times I hardly ever recommend, or they start some type of detoxification protocol that uses binders or some sort of chelators, like cilantro or whatever it may be, to start dumping some of these metals in the system, and they do very, very poorly with it. Okay. Meaning that they feel worse, and they try and just chalk up the detox effects, but they never really get turn the corner from that standpoint. And it's when they stop the detox, it takes them a little while, and then they kind of bounce back to where they were, but they're not any better. That a lot of times is a standalone. When I hear that, I'm already going down the rabbit hole that this person is a toxic accumulator. And a lot of times the missing piece is the genetic component. And more often than not, that's kind of how we came up with, these are the genes to support with this toxic accumulator. Because more often than not, when I look at some of these genetics that has that scenario where they've tried to detoxify metals, or they know metal burden's there and they're trying to do it and it's not getting any better, more often than not, these people have genetic mutations in MTR genes. They have mutations in glutathione peroxidase or catalase or SOD, or some of the cytochrome P450 enzymes, things of that nature, where they've got genetic weakness there. Now what we do is we have that information, we plug the holes per se to support that genetic weakness to get the traffic moving a little bit better. All right, and now we come back and slowly introduce the same things they were doing before that they felt lousy on or didn't get the needle budge in the right direction. Now what happens is we start getting some momentum. So the analogy with that is if somebody, we use the analogy of traffic on a highway, right? Somebody goes into it with genetic weakness where instead of having 8 lanes, they got 1 based on their toxic accumulator type, and there's a bunch of traffic running the highway where traffic's at a standstill. And then now you do is you go in and you detoxify metals, all you're doing is you put more traffic on the highway that's not moving in the first place. All right. So my approach, and that's where this toxic accumulator type is, hey, before we start putting more traffic on the highway, let's start doing some things to allow traffic to start slowly moving. All right, maybe redirect some traffic around to the next exit, get that traffic moving, even if it's at a slow crawl. And then what we can do, slowly add some traffic on the highway, because now traffic is moving for the first time. And so that's where this toxic accumulator type came up with it, just because of years of experience, seeing people saying the same thing. I've got heavy metals and I can't detoxify. And a lot of this came, working with patients with mercury toxicity, working with a lot of the biological dentists that I work with. And they send me these patients that, need to detox. They need to dampen that metal burden before or after getting their amalgams out. And there was this reoccurring theme. A lot of these people were really, really sensitive to metal detox. And we started noticing that a lot of these people had a lot of the genetic stories that were very, very similar in terms of peroxidation and methionine synthase. And we plugged those holes. And now what happened is we start seeing change, and we start, you get the needle going in the right direction in terms of how they feel. But more importantly, we're dampening that accumulation of metals on their system that can just continue to lead to, poor health.
Right. And so it kind of fits really nicely with the way that you mentioned we put our program together. We put it together where we have 7 genetic types that we find. People may have more than one type. And I'm getting a lot of questions on that, John. So we'll have to do another Facebook Live on, hey, what if I'm an overstimulator and understimulator? So we'll start to put some content together in terms of what if I have 3 or 4 different genetic types going on at the same time? How do you approach that? But basically what we do is, like you mentioned, we start with a nutrigenomic test, preferably one that's going to be complete and not missing a lot of SNPs so that we get a complete picture. And we do that on our site, which people should know, John, that we have the ability to get these tests on our site. So
Right.
that's another tool that we are developing. But either way, you get your genetic type, you fill out a questionnaire, which is a free mini course, and you see what your particular genetic type is. And then from there, you can learn what the gene SNPs you'd want to look at on that nutrigenomic test. And then from there, we really put together a nice dietary approach for that particular genetic type or types, what things to look at in terms of nutritionals and what tests to really look at. But really, like you said, it comes down to doing the foundational stuff. So maybe talk about, for other people that aren't familiar with our work, how the pyramid really plays in terms of, hey, we realize that we got to understand your genetic type. We realize that we got to understand what your SNPs are that are challenging. But these are the priorities in terms of the major expenses going on in your highway that you're not going to take enough methylfolate and methylcobalamin for to really address those overflowing buckets, if you will. So I guess the question is, what priorities do we also really encourage people understand if they're a toxic accumulator or there are other types that really need to be identified and addressed and worked on, no matter what their genetic type is? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
so yeah, absolutely. Because that kind of comes into where we kind of started this concept of really trying to prioritize the big picture genetics, because what happens is, this all started with MTHFR for a lot of people. I still, every single week, almost every single day, I get somebody that their doctor ran MTHFR on them, and they realize real quickly that there's more to the story, and more to the story are some of these other priorities. And so we kind of developed this hierarchy just, from doing this and looking at genetic reports and working with patients with chronic issues, is there's bigger fish in the sea, and there's bigger fish genetically that revolve around inflammation a lot, and really everything goes back to inflammation at some level. But the thing is a lot of times people can't get the needle going in the right direction because there's bigger players that are not being looked at or addressed. And then from there, we've kind of clustered that into the 7 core genetic types. And so if there's some key players that have to be looked at with every single person beyond MTHFR. And if you've been listening to us talk, my deal breakers out of the gate with, pretty much every person I work with. Every person has an issue with histamine, or every person has an issue with iron until proven wrong. Because the thing is like, if those stories are not being addressed properly, everything else, can be effective, because there's a lot of things that feed off of that. But if we talk about kind of big players, big priorities, obviously histamine control. We talk about Finton reactions and how iron and copper can put lighter fluid on the fire if we got this issue with peroxidation, which is going to affect things like toxicities in the body. It's going to affect immune function in the body. It's going to deplete glutathione, so now we can't fight the fight against infections we get exposed to. And then also mitochondrial support, because the thing is, I just spoke to a person, yesterday, another one of these patients that, fluoroquinolone accident. They took Cipro, and now she's, in a wheelchair, literally like overnight. We see some of these reoccurring themes where people go into with some of these genetic weaknesses, and they have stressors that come at them that cause those genes to express, and their life is never the same until you start supporting, those aspects to kind of really create a lot of rebuilding and restabilization where some of that genetic weakness is. And so what happens is, we got to kind of have this shift from just like MTHFR and taking B vitamins, because it's more than that. And most likely there's people out there where MTHFR is the only piece of the puzzle. and they take methylfolate and their world is completely changed. And that was the biggest priority. There are people out there. Unfortunately, it's far and few between. But we got to realize, just have this understanding that there's more to it, and understanding that there's a hierarchy through this, and there's things at the bottom that are so foundational that a lot of times are not being looked at and being addressed, that are major factors of why people aren't getting any momentum in terms of recovery. And that's where we kind of evolved this genetic type concept to really make it easy to help people understand where the heck they start. And then from there, what the heck do they do about it? All right. And then if they get stuck from there, then maybe it's time to look, to reach out for some help. But the thing is, you can get a lot of momentum, and you can do a lot of foundational and groundwork by understanding what your genetic type is, what are the things you have to look at, and what are the things you got to do to support that. And then that gets a whole lot of momentum going in the right direction for you.
Yeah, awesome stuff. And we have on the YouTube, Your Genetic Type, we have some videos on those two major deal breakers on iron metabolism and histamine issues. And actually, John, when I was talking to Dr. Bob Miller, he was talking about how he asked me, how much do I see? Because I told him I do a lot of work with adrenals. He goes, how much do you see that actually being a mast cell activation histamine thing? And I was like, we were really happy when you changed the pyramid and had the histamine lower down, because you taught me this, John, in terms of not just foods. I think people get wrapped up on, okay, I'm doing a low histamine based diet, but we're talking about stress, right? I mean, that's where mast cells degranulate from just stress. Also the environment, pollens and danders and pets, even alcohol. But then the last thing is the immune system, right? If the immune system is wound up, that's going to create a lot of mast cells, which is ultimately going to use up those methyl groups that aren't working super well. And now all of a sudden the weak link in the chain breaks, where someone takes fluoroquinolone and now they're in a wheelchair the next day. So those are right. So
yeah. And even to take it another step further, some really cool research that I've been reading, some new stuff. There's research articles for years ago, but some newer research articles about mast cells embedded in the thyroid, and mast cells degranulation in the thyroid tissue as a mechanism for Hashimoto. So I would think that, these mast cells, they're probably in the adrenals as well, that are things that can affect function going forward too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, awesome. So great stuff. So basically we have this tool. Just tell them about where they can get these pieces of information. Of course, with also saying wherever you're watching this, because we upload this to a couple of other Facebook sites, click on the link, but basically tell them what their options are in terms of where they can get more information.
Yeah. So first thing you want to do is go to yourgenetictype.com. And there you're going to see some information, and you are going to have a couple resources to learn what your genetic type is. And you can, for free, just put your email in and register for our Your Genetic Type mini course, basically, which is a hand-holding session to actually walk you through how to determine what your genetic type is. And then once you've done that, then you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take our Your Genetic Type Unlock course. And what that's going to do is it's over 10 hours of information that's going to walk you through, once you determine what your genetic type is, these are the core genes that go with that genetic type. These are the lab tests that you strongly want to consider looking at, which are all available on our yourgenetictype.com website. So those are the tests you're going to test the clinical relevance of these genes. And it's also going to teach you, these are the supplements. This is the best dietary regimen you should follow for each of those genetic types and which one you fall into. So yourgenetictype.com is going to give you those resources to take the mini course, learn your genetic type. And then we got a course that's $97 that you can actually take, and you can do it at your own pace. It's going to teach you how to go down these rabbit holes, how to address them, so you can start getting things going in the right direction. I also strongly recommend you follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Your Genetic Type, and we're putting information out every single week, and this stuff is evolving, but the core foundation of the genetic type is there. So I strongly encourage everybody to go figure out what your genetic type is.
Yeah, and then on top of that is the membership, which we'll be adding this month coming up, where you'll be able to look over our shoulder, have a case review a couple times per month. And then any courses that we produce, like the unlocked course, the mini course, those will all be accessible in the membership site. I was thinking, John, just talking today, because I know a lot of people have these challenges, which you've put this together and you work with the Organic Dental Association with, you know, the higher ups, in terms of giving someone a one-off course of, hey, I want to get my amalgams removed, but I also want to make sure that I'm doing it properly. How do I factor in my genetic type with that and give a nice course like that? So that's
Yeah.
some.
And that's something that's actually on the to-do list, man. I know I mentioned this to you, Joel, that we're going to put a course like that together, and we're going to actually bring Dr. Lori Stevens in, who's the former president of the HDA, to do a small section that I talk about from the dental aspect of, you know, what are the concerns, you know, before you sit in that chair, and then also to talk about dental decay, you know, and you know how your genetic type plays into this. Because one thing I see a lot, and I know a lot of these holistic dentists and other dentists have seen a lot, is pediatrics. A lot of dental weakness, a lot of, you know, increased cavity components in kids, and there is a genetic connection in terms of things we talked about today, that toxic accumulator that can start that process of mineral displacement and lead to weakened teeth and bones.
Yeah, and just to remind people who don't think they have a toxic accumulating type because of heavy metals, because they may say, I don't have amalgams, you'd be grossly wrong. There's so many ways that vertical transmission, meaning from mom and even mom's mom, even though mom delivered you, it could pass down the generations. And not to mention, again, the environment and a lot of the sources of, you know, controversial stuff and fluids and water and immunizations and all of the stuff in between, where it's really, you know, it's ubiquitous, right? I mean, it's everywhere where we go. So that's amazing. This was a really awesome presentation today, John, if I don't mind saying so ourselves. So we look forward to giving you guys lots of useful information. Click on the link that you're watching this, or go to yourgenetictype.com, get that free course, and then really consider getting the paid course for $97. I mean, there's more than 12 hours in there. There's lots of value in there. Not only that, there's, between John and myself, over 20 years of doing this stuff and really boiling it down and leapfrogging, like John said, where if you have an MTR, you really want to do a metal test right away. That's going to save you years of headaches with the information that we've learned with that alone. So there's a lot of other really key tools that you're going to learn in there. And that's it, John. That's all I got. How about anything else you want to add?
No, nothing. Like I said, just go to our website and follow us. Every week we're putting out new information talking about this genetic type concept and how our genetics marry with our epigenetics and our environment and create that perfect storm with people. So if you're stuck and you got chronic health issues, you know, I can pretty much promise you some of the stuff we talk about is going to be, you know, factors that is going to want you to kind of investigate things a little bit deeper and a little bit further.
Yep, exactly. And I think most people are there already. They you know, they're looking for someone to quarterback it and take the ball and really look at the nuances that they're not doing, because everyone who tends to listen to this is a sophisticated crowd, and they're missing one or two key points of distinction that can really turn their life around. Maybe that's the last thing we can talk about. Can you share with us any major testimonial cases that was a toxic accumulator? You looked at their genetic polymorphisms, you saw that they were inhibited by these enzymes, it was the perfect, or by these toxins, it was the perfect storm. You put them on a protocol. What are some of the results you're seeing?
Well, you know, when you start decreasing that burden, you're taking a huge barrier off of function, and so function increases. And as you know, like I work with a lot of kids on the spectrum, and so that's where I see some significant gains pretty quickly. For instance, you know, just to think back of a follow-up from an email this week, there's a little girl that has Down syndrome, and basically was doing, you know, all the stuff. She went through GAPS diet, did all this, you know, things, fix the gut, everything else. Gut never really changed from a microbiome standpoint. Still had a lot of those opportunistic bacteria running rampant. So we looked at it from a genetic perspective and looked at it from a toxicity standpoint. And She had some of these genetic components that fell into toxic accumulator. We started a slow, chelation protocol. And then what we did is layered in some stuff to start addressing the gut function. And for the first time, follow-up stool testing actually was significantly different. And the biggest thing with that is, yes, the testing changed, but then what happened is from the start of the school year last year to the end of the school year last year, she gained, almost based on her curriculum and her benchmarks, almost 3 grade levels in terms of like reading and comprehensive aspects, which was awesome, and so I love hearing those milestone gains in the kids. That's something that we see all the time, which is awesome. And so really what it comes down to with anybody is, if you start getting that traffic moving and you start taking traffic off the road, some magical things happen, which is awesome.
Yeah, and nowadays, like I was talking to Susan Owen, who started that research in autism, and she says her major clients now are adults, right? So we're talking about adults that have neurodegenerative inflammation that ultimately are toxic accumulators. They're noticing that, their doctor's telling them that it's just aging, it's brain fog, it's
Right.
a company because of aging, but this is for you, and this is, I think for purpose, John, is to really change the model of healthcare. I think that's one of our bigger purposes down the road, in terms of getting at the grassroots and getting in the fields and helping people at this level, but making enough of a noise to really change the way that healthcare is practiced as well. So that's it, man. So, yourgenetictype.com, check out those free resources, and then put any comments in the thread here, because we can't see the live comments as we do this, and we will go back and answer your questions. If there's anything you have questions for, you want us to talk about, make sure you put that in the feed, and we'll listen to that information and put our next talk or talks into those pieces of the puzzle too. Awesome. All right, John, we'll talk to you soon. You have a good rest of your day.
You too. Take care.
Bye.